Thank you. And speaking of what specific governments are doing, this is a question for Julie. What I have here is, do you believe the Ontario Cap and Trade program will be effective in reducing emissions in Ontario?
So many jurisdictions have decided, most jurisdictions in Canada, most Canadians live in a jurisdiction where there is a price on carbon. And we've done it different ways across the country. In British Columbia, there's a carbon price. And in Ontario and Quebec, we've implemented a cap and trade system. We have not yet audited, I don't believe our auditors generals have yet audited the efficacy, the ability of these prices on carbon to drive down emissions. But that would be a future audit that we could look at. Anybody else? Okay.
Moving on to
I wouldn't add anything to what Julie said.
I have a question here at the municipal level. Climate risk assessment is an area of active works at the city level in Canada. Do you have recommendations for networking the results of that work that's taking place, that assessment of risk work that is taking place at the level of cities? How to share that information with senior levels of government so that we can achieve a cohesive national risk inventory and action plan?
So let me first start by saying I audit at only the federal government. My colleagues here edit the provincial governments. However, the provincial governments or the territories are much closer to the municipalities. So I think it would be best to allow the provinces, I know Nova Scotia has done some community assessments, but I think we should start. Sure. Glenn, do you want to start with that?
Sure. That's actually something we looked at in our audit of the Northwest Territories. The Department of the Environment and Natural Resources, one of its responsibilities is to provide to communities and NGOs and other interested parties information on climate change that they can then take and use to prepare themselves for the effects of climate change. And of course, in the north, those effects are much more, if I could say, real. People are dealing with them now, especially in isolated communities. It's impacting on their traditional way of life, their ability to hunt, to fish. So it's very important, especially in the north. What we found is that the communities across the territories were asking for this information, but unfortunately, the territorial government didn't have the information or didn't have it packaged in a way that could be of use to communities. So that's something that came across loud and clear in our audit. And to its credit, the territorial government in the Northwest Territories has committed to, as part of its climate change strategic framework, which is going to be unveiling this year, which is going to include mitigation and adaptation strategies, a way forward in terms of better sharing the information that it already has that communities could find useful, but also identifying gaps in that information and identifying ways through what it calls its knowledge agenda to generate and then disseminate additional information that communities would find of great use. And again, in the north, this is very real, especially in Indigenous remote communities where climate change is having a very fundamental impact on folks' way of life.
Yeah. I remember New Brunswick did some community-based risk assessments. So the Auditor General of New Brunswick did that. And I know something was happening in Nova Scotia as well. Michael?
Sure. Let me comment on what we did in Nova Scotia, and at the risk of losing webinar participants, I won't sort of go into a long explanation in terms of mandate as Provincial Auditor General, but I would just say that the municipalities are not part of our audit universe, if you will. So we're not out there auditing municipalities. We're very much auditing the provincial government. Now, having said that, in response to the question, I like to say that, if you're living in a community on the Atlantic Ocean here in Nova Scotia, I think for the most part, in terms of climate change, you don't care if it's a municipal government, provincial government, or federal issue. You care about, whether you're going to get blown away while you're looking out at the Atlantic Ocean and what that means to your house. I think so. So having said that, in the audit, we asked the provincial government what type of work were they doing with municipalities, and what we found was a positive comment. We made two conclusions. purposes. One, that the government of Nova Scotia was working with municipalities on plans, and that those municipal plans covered many of the same risks and information that was required for the provincial plan. So that was a fairly positive statement, and one I think as the Auditor General would make sense to most people sitting at home around their kitchen table thinking about this, is that, you know, there would be some expectation that it would be considered. So I was very pleased as the Auditor General that the provincial government did work with municipalities, and we made those two favorable comments. So I know it's a long answer, and I tried not to get into too much of that mandate stuff, but I thought it was important at least to sort of set the stage.
Carol, did you want to add anything?
Yes, please. And indeed, when we did the audit in British Columbia, we ended up communicating with 33 of our local governments to ask them if there were any barriers in terms of things that they needed additional assistance with. And there were three categories that they came back with us, and it was pretty consistent right across the board. Now, one of it, of course, is the same problem that the whole system is facing, and that's lack of financial support. So that always comes through as one of the considerations. But they were also looking for more reliable data and knowledge to be shared with them, as well as clarity around provincial policies. So we were able to bring together the message from them to the provincial government, of course, for them to, for the province to look into.
At the federal level, I've done other audits that were not part of this report, where we did look at the tools that the federal government provides to municipalities. So we looked at things that I had never heard of before, where they were called IDF curves, so intensity, duration, frequency, and this is of storms, and whether or not the federal government was providing that information to municipalities in the way that they used to, or even to the provinces. We also looked at floodplain mapping, which was something that the federal government used to do, and we found that they were very old. So we have looked at some of the tools that do affect municipalities, but the federal government is sort of a whole step away from the municipalities, so it's a bit more difficult from my perspective to do that, which is really what's awesome about having the provincial and territorial representatives here today.
Thank you. I just want to remind everyone listening in that we are still taking questions, so keep submitting them, and they're good. I have one here from someone who's obviously familiar with our reports, because they're pointing out that we've provided in this report questions for readers to ask of legislatures or Canadians, for Canadians to ask, and that this person doesn't recall seeing this sort of thing in a previous AG report. So they're asking if this is a new practice for our office to provide readers with questions to hold governments to account. And the second part of that is, why did you all decide to go this route?
So let me start by answering, and my colleagues can add. Remember that each territory and province already submitted a climate change audit with specific recommendations to their legislatures, and I presented audits on mitigation and adaptation to the federal parliament. In those reports, we had recommendations. We all did. What we decided in the wrap-up report was that we weren't even sure who we would be writing recommendations for, because we were sending this to all of Canada and all of Canadian governments. So what we decided to do instead was provide this tool, which are questions that Canadians and legislatures can use to ask their governments and to hold them to account. So we're really pleased that somebody noticed that, and we hope that you use those questions. At the federal level, you can always send in a petition. We have a petition process which requires one signature, one letter, and you can ask all those questions, and the government must answer you within 120 days. So that's my preliminary answer to that question. I'll pass it over to Glenn.
And I don't want to sound defensive, but I would hope that our audits always suggest questions that either citizens or MLAs or members of parliament can ask of departments. So in this particular exercise, in both the Yukon and in the Northwest Territories, we've had standing committee hearings on our reports. And in both cases, MLAs asked pointed questions to representatives from the government. And in the case of the Northwest Territories, the Standing Committee on Government Operations has requested that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources come back to it within a number of months with an updated action plan on what it has done explicitly to address the recommendations we made in our report. So at least from the territorial perspective, there's a mechanism built in for those sorts of questions to be asked and to be followed up in the subsequent months and years.
Yeah. Carol, did you want to add anything?
Yes, I was going to also mention that the report that we issued in British Columbia, as similar with all of the other provinces across Canada and federally, will go to our Public Accounts Committee meeting, and they will also hold hearings on it. In British Columbia, the ministries are required to produce an action plan in response to the recommendations included in our report. So today we circulated the collaborative project to our legislature, and they will have the opportunity to include that in the discussion. So beyond the recommendations, they've also got those questions available to them to answer. So it'll be an interesting process here as well, a new one to have something that's at a national level.
So I don't see Michael anymore, but maybe we can hear you?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So on the issue of having questions in audits, so what we did is we started last year in 2017 on all of our audits to leave the reader, to leave the viewer of our videos with a few questions they may wish to ask now of their members of the legislature, of their Public Accounts Committee, to their government. So we started that before this one, and it really, for me, it came out of the video process we do. So for all of our audits, we do a 2-minute video, and it just seemed natural to leave a few questions there, that things people could do with what we gave them. So this very much, Julie including this in the summary report made a lot of sense for us, because we had started doing this and had good take-up in Nova Scotia on this last year when we began doing this.
And just to wrap up on this question, I mean, we mustn't forget that this really is a historic report. It is the first time that all the Auditors Generals have worked together, so many of them across the country. And so I think if people like the fact that we add questions, we can think about including that in our methodology. But please use those questions when you are asking questions of your government.